Right, okay, I'm going to start because I'll waffle for a minute or two and then other people can join as they feel fit. So this is the repeat of now we're out the holidays, it's the repeat of the Northwest hydrogen system. If you wouldn't mind muting if you're on the call, Dean. And the as before, this is being videoed. We might have moved the presentation on a little bit from where it was last time, but largely it's a repeat for those who are on holiday. This particular one's the smallest of the 5 we have because it's targeted at the Northwest hydrogen users and the HyNet group. We've taken that into consideration when we consider the workshop, so I get to that. But that's where we're at. So it's being taped, and there we are at it. I've now lost my slides. Okay, so this talk here, there are several routes to net zero for the NHS that we're proposing to help people with: geothermal energy, hydrogen, the subject of today, green district heating, which is a subject of a different session, and then some technologies, decarbonisation of gas, and then other methods which complement the missing one, which you might consider the obvious one, which is heat pumps. We haven't covered heat pumps specifically because they're relatively well understood now after a few years of installing them, and secondly, they're quite revenue intensive. So we've been trying to bring technologies that get you to net zero that don't require enormous grid connection or to be or very expensive to run. So this session deals with the hydrogen, and particularly the Northwest. The hydrogen sites, generally the sites across the NHS that can benefit from that are shown in our map. We've mapped all the 209 biggest emitters, and you can see the ones that we think can get hydrogen. The subject of this talk, is the right-hand one, which are the trusts and bodies around the Northwest that we think can benefit from getting near net zero through the HyNet initiative. Okay, I'll hand over to HyNet, who will tell you what they're up to.
Thank you, Clive. By way of introduction, my name is Martin Shannon. I'm Head of Commercial Services within Cadent Gas. Next slide, please, Clive. So Cadent Gas, if you're not aware, we're the largest gas distribution network in the UK, basically covering from Norwich up to Manchester and then down to London. And we, as it says on the slide, got about 132,000 kilometres of natural gas pipeline, of which we want to, start to convert some of that to convey hydrogen, which is the purpose of today. Next slide, please. So the government really is putting its shoulder behind decarbonisation with its ambition to get to, net zero by 2050. It is a Government does change quite quickly, so Grant Shapps is out. He's now Energy Secretary, and Claire Coutinho is now in, but the strategy is still the same, and they are putting their shoulder behind carbon capture and use, which is what HyNet is. So basically, carbon capture and use is taking CO2, capturing it and sequestering it offshore, and HyNet will be looking to make low carbon hydrogen by taking natural gas.
Through an estimating if you just if you include Amy, that's fine.
Through natural gas, and the CO2 is sequestered offshore with the hydrogen going into a new network. If you move forward, please, Claire. So as I mentioned, the going back to Boris Johnson's days with the 10-point plan, we've had a number of policy decisions which is helping to underpin the hydrogen strategy. With the most latest ones is the business models and what the government call the minded to position. So this really is the model by which the hydrogen networks will get funded. So very much like the natural gas networks of today, which is a regulated asset base, the hydrogen transportation and storage, which is the business model to fund the build out of the new high pressure steel hydrogen network, is going to be a regulated asset base. That's the kind of the position where government's landed at the moment. And we, Cadent, and other track 1 clusters, there's another one on the East Coast, are now in discussions with government around the shape and feel of that business model, which we hope to agree and land by 2025. Similarly, I've got colleagues from Vertex and also Grenian Hydrogen, and they'll be talking around the hydrogen production business models and how they will get their funding as well. The purpose of the business models really is to subsidise the cost of the hydrogen. So effectively, it will bring down the cost of hydrogen production and allow the producers to sell the hydrogen roughly at the natural gas price. But obviously, by burning hydrogen, there's no carbon, and therefore large natural gas users will have carbon savings called ETS, and government's mandatory position on that is that those savings will be allowed to be retained by the off-taker. And that's quite helpful because obviously to take hydrogen into your plants, there's a cost there to achieve. So using some of those savings to achieve that is a helpful pathway as well from government. There's also policy decisions around hydrogen for heat. So how can we get hydrogen into homes? And there's a trial that's going to take place in Redcar in the northwest to demonstrate not about building out new hydrogen networks, but how can you repurpose existing hydrogen natural gas networks to take hydrogen. Next slide, please, Clive. So the regulations for hydrogen. So is quite helpful actually, because hydrogen is actually a gas under the Gas Act. So a lot of the regulatory and legislative backdrop for hydrogen is already in place. So we're not starting from a blank canvas here, which is helpful. Hydrogen production, producers are going to obtain a low carbon hydrogen agreement from BESNES, and that's a 15-year agreement which will allow them to produce a volume of hydrogen, which will then allow them to sell that hydrogen, as I mentioned, at roughly the natural gas price. Cadent is obviously, we're seeking the transportation and storage business model. So we're looking going to be the transporter of the hydrogen. Another organisation called Innovan is going to produce hydrogen storage using salt caverns in the northwest, which is very receptive for that sort of hydrogen storage in the ground. And you do need hydrogen storage if you really want to get the best use case out of hydrogen. Hydrogen is harder to compress, so having storage allows, for example, hydrogen to be used for peak power generation plants where they ramp on and ramp off quite quickly. You may have heard a lot of talk around different hydrogen colours, green hydrogen, blue hydrogen and purple hydrogen. Government now has kind of moved away from that by having what's called a low carbon hydrogen standard. So that low carbon hydrogen standard means that any hydrogen, but no matter how it's produced, either electrolytic or through autothermal reformers, as long as it meets the low carbon hydrogen standard, it is classed as low carbon hydrogen and would attract the corresponding subsidy on the low carbon hydrogen agreement, which again is helpful, and that includes scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions within that standard that the producer needs to be able to demonstrate. Next slide, please. So there's a number of schemes we are working on as Cadent. HyNet in the northwest is by far the most advanced, and that should have hydrogen flowing by late 2027, early 2028. We've also got a sister project called East Coast Hydrogen, which is running slightly behind, and that's going to be around 2030. But we're also looking to see how can we use hydrogen elsewhere across the country. So Capital H down in London, and there's a lot of very large gas users, Tate and Lyle and others, who equally want to have access to hydrogen, and also looking to decarbonise hydrogen in the centre, or I call that project Hydrogen Valley. But the two main projects at the moment are HyNet in the northwest and East Coast, and they're the ones that are going to put large scale pipeline infrastructure into the ground, obviously subject to the business models. But the opportunity for other organisations who are producing electrolytic hydrogen, much smaller scale, They can be more agile and they can be deployed where there's a valid off-taker and a short length of pipe. So hydrogen, has a number of different ways it can be deployed, both at scale and also more tactically as well. Next scheme, please. Next slide, please. So this slide really kind of shows how we sort of see hydrogen rollout happening at scale. So I've just mentioned that HyNet is going to be operational by late 2027, with East Coast coming on in the 2030s. But we've also got colleagues in national gas transmission. So national gas transmission at the moment take gas from the beach, like St Fergus up in the north, down the big pipes to the distribution networks. So a project called Project Union is looking to say, how can we repurpose some of those very large gas feeders to convey hydrogen? And when that starts to happen, the economics and the attractiveness of those clusters will start, we think, to start bridging between the clusters. So Project Union starts to build a backbone for hydrogen, and the existing clusters then start to have an attractiveness which attracts the investment to have hydrogen across clusters. So that's kind of the long view and the long strategy, because as we mentioned, if we can produce hydrogen that's low carbon, cost effective, it's a very clean fuel, especially for high process intensive industries. Next slide, please. So drilling in a little bit deeper onto the HyNet. So HyNet's a consortium of it's quite a wide consortium, but the four key players is Eni. Eni is providing the offshore carbon capture and storage using the old depleted oil wells, and their pipeline has gone through development consent at the moment, which is the red one on the left going off to the old field. HyNet itself is obviously the white lines on the map you can see, and we've just gone through statutory consultation on 124 kilometres of that routing corridor as well. Vertex and our colleague Joe from Vertex is going to be talking shortly about the Vertex operations, which is going to produce the hydrogen. And then, as I mentioned, we've also got our colleagues at Innoven, which is part of INEOS, which are going to provide the geological storage. Next slide, please. We estimate in the northwest the regional demand is around about 30 terawatts, 30 terawatts an hour a year, which is quite significant. The network we're designing, that's just gone through the statutory DCO, is 42-inch pipes, which is running, if you're technical, at 44.5 bar, but that can be upgraded to 75 bar. So it means that as more demand for hydrogen comes on, we don't need to lay new pipes. And as I mentioned, we're looking to have the phase 1 and phase 2 of the network operational by Q4 2027. Next slide, please. It is demand led, so all of the organisations that you can see on this graphic are all under what we call memorandums of understanding, and are working very closely with Cadent and Vertex on how they are themselves going to be ready by 2027, 2028 to start to take hydrogen when the network is built. As I mentioned, HyNet is a consortium of Vertex, Innoven and Cadent, but importantly, it's also got all of the clients, and the clients need to be ready to take the hydrogen by that time as well. So we all need to kind of move in a coherent manner to get to our respective final investment decisions. And we hold regular forums with all of the users that you can see on this slide. And we thank Clive for reaching out, because it's great to be talking to the NHS trusts today as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it's just about, at the moment, trying to really finalise the business models with government so we can take our respective final investment decisions to lay the pipes and build out the capex. Obviously, that then gives a surety to the clients to start to make the changes necessary at the plant level to take hydrogen. And typically the plants will be having a hydrogen feed and a natural gas feed in the early years and do blending on site, because obviously when you've got limited production in the early years, you want to have that resilience. If you're running a glass kiln or something like that, you need to still have the resilience. So in the early years, they'll have a blended model. Next slide, please. This really just sort of tries to illustrate how close HyNet is to some various NHS trusts. So the green that you can see on the graphic is HyNet Phase 2. That's the one that's just gone through statutory consultation on the routing corridor, and that's 124 kilometres. And then the red is additional pipeline that will come on from 2030, and that will build out HyNet Phase 3. And obviously the little crosses are where we've mapped on the trusts, so we'll be able to build, you know, small scale infrastructure spurs to those trusts in the event that the trusts would like to take hydrogen into their fuel mix. And I think I've got one last slide. Well, that might be it. That's it. Thank you, Clive.
Okay, I can hand over.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joe Ward here representing Vertex Hydrogen. And as Martin mentioned, we are the developer of the hydrogen plants that sit within the middle of the HyNet cluster. Next slide, please, Clive. So Vertex is a joint venture formed between SR, who own the refinery at Stanlow. So some of you may be aware of the refinery here at Stanlow, given that you live and work relatively nearby, and a low carbon project developer, Progressive Energy. And our vision really is to deliver 2 large at scale low carbon hydrogen plants by 2027. So producing over 1 gigawatt of hydrogen. And I'll talk a little bit later about what 1 gigawatt really means. So it just feels like a very big number, but we'll try and visualize what that looks like. Our objective really is to provide quick and meaningful decarbonisation to the Northwest region to help the UK meet its targets under upcoming carbon budgets over the next 5, 10, 15 years. We're on a journey from here to net zero in 2050, and within each 5-year period between now and 2050, we've committed to, as a country, emit less and less CO2. So we're looking at how we fit into that overall strategy for the UK to deliver a meaningful amount of decarbonisation via hydrogen for the UK as early as 2027. Initially, our first customers will be large natural gas users, so large emitters, refining, glass manufacturing, aluminium recycling, steel, and other things like that. And then later rolling out to the smaller, more dispersed, but just as important to reach net zero users of natural gas, homes, vehicles, who obviously use petrol and diesel, but it also commercial buildings, including things like hospitals. Next slide, please, Clive. So on the left-hand side, you see the graphic that Martin showed earlier, which is sort of a map of the HyNet cluster. And we are the low carbon hydrogen production plant that sits at the very heart of that cluster. It's situated on the land here at Stanlow Manufacturing Complex, pretty close by to the existing refinery. The complex here is looking to basically transition from an oil refinery to a low carbon energy hub over the next however many years, and this is going to be one of the major first steps in that journey. The process we'll talk about in more detail, but you can get a feel for what the plant looks like in the 3D model presented on the right hand side. So it looks like a large industrial facility, and essentially we're looking to build a plant that can deliver significant quantities of hydrogen, which is low carbon, so genuinely supporting the UK's ambitions to reduce its CO2 emissions. And we do that by capturing over 97% of the CO2 that is produced, and E&I will store that in Liverpool Bay area. Next slide, please, Clive. But essentially, this is low carbon hydrogen made from natural gas, which Martin referred to earlier as blue hydrogen, and a lot of people will talk about it being blue hydrogen. And the government's push at the moment is to say hydrogen could be any colour it wants as long as it meets the emission ceiling that they have set upon us to be considered low carbon. So we're a CCS enabled hydrogen plant. We take natural gas and we mix that with steam. We pass it over a number of catalytic reactors at high temperature and a moderate pressure. And essentially that turns that stream of water and methane and other light hydrocarbon gases into hydrogen and CO2. That CO2 is then isolated using a carbon capture package, and that is compressed and sent to E&I for storage in permanent geological storages in Liverpool Bay, capturing over 90% of the CO2 in that stream to be captured permanently underground. The other stream is hydrogen, which we purify to a very high purity, over 99.9%. We compress it up to a pressure required to get into Cadent's network, which Martin mentioned earlier, and then Cadent will ship that hydrogen on our behalf to a number of off-takers around the region. We're delivering the project in two and more phases, but the first two phases are under development, are seriously under development at this point, with planning applications submitted and the like. The first one will be servicing very local off-takers, so within 2 to 3 kilometres of the plant, and then through the Cadent network, the second plant will allow us to reach off-takers further afield within the northwest region. Next slide then, please, Clive. So what is a gigawatt? Well, I just wanted to try and give people a rough idea of scale of what 1 gigawatt actually means. So a gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts, and a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. So a gigawatt is 1 million kilowatts. And just to give you a feeling, the average kettle in the UK is 2 to 3 kilowatts. So this is a big, meaningful amount of hydrogen. It's enough to decarbonise a city the size of Liverpool, for example. It will capture 1.8 million tonnes of CO2, which is the same as taking around 750,000 of cars off the road. I tried to look for a parallel that might make more sense to an NHS audience. If medical incinerators was the sort of thing that the NHS is looking to decarbonise at the moment, the one shown here can burn over 3 tonnes of medical waste each day. It consumes 750 kilowatts of fuel, and today that's diesel, LPG or natural gas. We make enough hydrogen to convert 1,350 of these to hydrogen with our first 2 plants, which is more than the number of hospitals in the UK. So you can see that the 2 plants we're looking to develop here could have a significant dent in the emissions of the area. I think that's everything from me, Clive. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay. I think we look like we've got, okay, right, we're on to Grenian now.
Hi there, afternoon. So I'm Joseph Bailey. I'm head of projects at Grenian Hydrogen. So Grenian is a joint venture formed to progress electrolytic hydrogen projects that I'll be talking about today as an alternative to the CCS enabled option that Joe just took you through. Clive, do you want to go to the next slide? So Grenian is a joint venture between Progressive Energy, Statkraft and Foresight. So Progressive Energy are a low carbon development company. Statkraft are Europe's largest renewable energy company. They're a Norwegian state-owned energy provider. And Foresight are a infrastructure investment company specializing in low carbon infrastructure investment projects. So together we've joined forces to develop electrolytic hydrogen projects, particularly in the northwest of England and North Wales. We currently have 7 projects in our project portfolio, and they're shown kind of at the bottom in the SPVs. Slightly out of date slide with the 6 shown here, but we've recently launched another. Do you want to go to the next slide, Clive? So as I mentioned, our focus at the moment is around the northwest of England and North Wales. The reason for that is largely related to the HyNet project, which Martin outlined. So it's an extremely attractive area for low carbon project development. It's also one of the largest industrial areas in the UK. Both of those things really help build confidence in developing low carbon infrastructure. And it's also an area where we can have the biggest impact on the total UK CO2 emissions. You can see our project partners there. So we're working with a lot of big organisations on sites like Kellogg's and Tata, Pilkingtons and NSERC. And we're also starting to work on cluster development. And those are kind of two different concepts which may be interesting to different trusts. So if I take the Kellogg's example, we look to lease land on a Kellogg's plant, develop an electrolytic hydrogen project and sell to them directly in a kind of one-to-one basis. Whereas in a project like Speak, we're working with multiple partners where we're developing a hydrogen pipeline system between multiple users and providing, a range of off-takers basically with hydrogen. So we do both kind of cluster development, but also kind of individual projects in our portfolio. Go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we currently have a 200 megawatt portfolio across 7 projects. They're at different stages of development. Our most advanced project is on the right. That's the Cheshire Green Hydrogen project. It's a 30 megawatt electrolyser that's actually in bilateral negotiations with government for long-term revenue support under the hydrogen business model. We then have 4 projects in feed and consenting and a couple of bigger projects which are in the early feasibility stage. All of these projects use the same technology, so the idea is to be replicable, and that allows us to move at speed. So once we've done one project, the next one we can do quicker, cheaper, more effectively, and that we just roll this out quickly. And just to give you an idea of scale again, so current portfolio could displace 252,000 tons of CO2, and that's the equivalent emissions from 32,000 homes. So these are decent scale projects, slightly smaller than the gigawatt that obviously Joe was just talking about, but definitely making a meaningful impact on UK emissions. Next slide, please. So just to give you a high level overview how it works, our typical kind of model is we lease land preferably on or at least adjacent to an existing site. We then develop the hydrogen production facility, but as best as possible, we try and tie into existing services. So we will need power supply that can either be from co-located renewables, so onshore solar, wind, or a grid connection. We then connect into water for water supply, but we also need to look at drainage for kind of water effluent from the process and surface water. We sell hydrogen to the site, which displaces your natural gas or other fossil fuel use. We sell that at the equivalent price, so there's no net increase in your energy costs. And basically the difference between our generation costs and that price is supported by the government under a revenue support scheme. In order to facilitate that, you will need to invest in hydrogen-ready equipment. There's lots of information about, hydrogen-ready boilers, demonstration projects that my company, Progressive Energy, have performed to demonstrate hydrogen use for heat, which I think is the majority of your kind of gas demand. But there may be some upgrades that you need to do to facilitate that. Next slide, please. So basically, these projects are all supported by government subsidy schemes under the hydrogen business model. Each of them are supported under what's called a hydrogen allocation round. That's basically a competitive process where projects bid for government support. The first one is the HAR1 process that's currently ongoing, with projects aiming to be operational by 2025, such as our Cheshire Green Hydrogen. There's shortly to launch the HAR2 process, which will be the next round for projects due to be operational in 2026 to 2029. And then in 2025, there would be the HAR3 process. I think realistically, from where we are today, most of these sites will be targeting HAR3, and therefore you're looking at kind of being operational 2027 to 2030. But obviously, we need to do a good bit of development work by that 2025 submission date. So in order to qualify for funding, you have to have a minimum project size of 5 megawatt thermal. And I know that does rule out a number of sites in the wider UK in terms of gas demand. However, as I said in kind of one of the models, if a particular site doesn't have high gas demand themselves, there's still the possibility to do things as a kind of mini network if there's other companies in the area who may benefit from low carbon hydrogen. Then there are also alternatives such as getting hydrogen from the HyNet pipeline, which doesn't have that restriction. There's various kind of funding schemes available to support development, which you may want to look into and find out what's applicable for yourselves. There's funding schemes we can access as well for the green hydrogen development part of things. And it's shown a bit there by the timeline, but really we expect kind of 2 to 3 years construction timelines for these projects. So in the event of bidding into the government process in 2025, that's how we're able to achieve that 2027 to 2030 operational target date. So it's something that can be done quite quickly. The other thing is the ability to learn from that quite quickly. So if we can construct projects in 2 years, it improves the speed by which we then have learnings to take into the next batch of projects. And I think that's all my slides. So I'll pass back to yourself, Clive, to wrap up.
Excellent. Well, thank you to all three of you. So a lot of principles there that apply to the Northwest and some that apply more generally. Now, so trusts have access to this, whether they can hold access through the Cadent network in due course, or whether they go through the electrolyzers in the shorter term. The timeline to some degree is site dependent. We're trying to if people want to try and get to net zero quite soon, the considerations are what needs to be done on your site to make you ready, because you heard this exercise about bringing the supply and the demand together at the same place at the same time. So site condition, backlog, and consequent funding from it's required, your exact geography and own internal timescales, or factors, and then something called the ecosystem, because the initial NHS collaboration covers the 209 biggest users in the NHS, but as soon as we have those, we're all heading towards a net zero plan. There is the need to tackle the next 1,680 sites, which are mental health, community, and a variety of other sites across the NHS. And obviously, if there's an ecosystem near your hospital, and in many cases there are, then it can be included in the actual timescales. Sorry, somebody isn't muted. If you wouldn't mind, is that Martin? If you wouldn't mind muting yourself. So by addressing a hydrogen approach and some of the other approaches as well, you might be able to address more than just your big emitter sites and start to get into the local, the rest of your responsibilities as well. So hydrogen is the one technology which doesn't necessarily require de-steaming. So all the other technologies really have to be low temperature hot water, or better still, even lower temperature, moving towards 40-degree water in due course for everything except domestic hot water. So if you have steam and you've got a very good steam system and need to keep it going, then you really need to look towards a hydrogen solution, because that will give you the temperatures that you're looking for. Because if you're going to go geothermal or district heating or any of the other technologies, you're going to have to go low temperature. The other consideration is revenue and capital, but revenue in particular is a thing. Now, geothermal can pay its way over time. District energy, if it complies with the Energy Act, can pay its way over time. And hydrogen, because of the hydrogen business model, but what the hydrogen business model means, I'll tell you in a second, means that hydrogen may well be able to pay for itself as well, because the government intends to do what it did for electricity to pay for the wind turbines. It puts everybody's electricity price up, so that they make a profit over one area that's subsidizing the area that needs subsidizing. And that's effectively what will happen with hydrogen. Gas prices for everybody who use gas will go up, and that will drive the hydrogen price down, and where they balance will be where it ends up. So you'll be ending up paying the same price per kilowatt hour whether you use gas or hydrogen. But of course, if you're using gas, you're not going to be net zero compliant, which has all kinds of other problems. And then whether you go for electrolyzer solution, or whether you go for a Cadent type solution from carbon capture, depends a lot on grid issues, whether you can get power to near you, whether you have spare land or have spare land near you, you might be able to jump straight to an electrolyzer solution. And certainly Grenian are an example of companies that you'll meet if you come to our workshops that can offer you an electro solution rather than a carbon capture solution. So this, I won't labour the side, but the support that the NH Power team are giving you is this exercise. We're in the August and September presentations now. We're doing the repeats. So we're repeating the HyNet today, and we'll go through geothermal and the wider hydrogen position and the other technologies shortly. In November, we will have, we'll go to IHEM, and we will, at the IHEM, will be workshops. We're now looking to combine the hydrogen workshops. So the 11th of October will be Hydrogen Day, and we're going to combine the HyNet and the rest of the country hydrogen into one longer workshop starting at 10:30 in the morning. And if you want to attend that, make sure you get yourself an invite to it by clicking on the link, which I'll send to you shortly, or letting me know, and I'll put you on the system. Because we only have space in the workshops for 40 to 50 people. Otherwise, we'll be stacking people up like sardines, which might happen. We'll have to see. And then at the workshops, you'll be rubbing shoulders with the providers. The people who've been speaking to you today mostly will be there, and the others from the other hydrogen network will be talking to you. So you'll have developers, you'll have shippers, and electrolyzer people all there, ready to speak to you, and get a chance to speak to them and find out what it is you need to find. In November and December, we will start some road shows to get local meetings there. And the Northwest Roadshow is currently scheduled not for November, but for the 27th of October. At the moment, we've been offered a room effectively to gather in Blackburn. We might be able to find something in Manchester. If somebody feels like hosting this, let me know. We need a room, we need access to some coffee and drinks like that, and a screen and so on. And then we will attempt to help people cost their schemes. So you should know which technology you want by the end of IHEM. And then November, you can take that to the roadshow, and we'll give you some tools that'll give you an idea of what costings and revenue consequences you need to put to that technology, so that when you write your net zero plan, it starts to look like a proper plan. And then the collaboration hopefully will extend into operations. So for instance, procurement, if we need to procure consultants or advisors or contractors or anything else, and there is support, people want support, then we'll look to see whether we can provide that support to trusts. I think that's getting close to the end of this, because most of us you've seen the initial talks and the follow-up talks. We're into the follow-up now. I've told you the workshop days, so that's there. I've told you the objective by the end of IHEM is to have a pretty good idea of which technology you want to use, and on the roadshow what it's going to cost. So you should know your options. You should know what site investments required, and be in a position to start talking about where that's going to come from. And you should have basic costs and a net zero plan. You should also be in a group with other trusts, so that you can work with other trusts, so that you're not in this on your own. And that's the benefits of collaboration. And we're not doing too badly time-wise. I can open it up to the other speakers who will be hopefully taking questions on the chat. If you've got a question to ask and you haven't put on the chat, put on the chat very quickly. Is there anything, team, that you want to pick up that that's come out of the questions?